Rarely are there moments in gaming history that define an entire generation within a single day. One of the most memorable for younger gamers was Sony's unveiling of the PlayStation 4 at E3 2013. The showcase wasn't revolutionary. Sony as a company announced nothing for the PlayStation 4 that wasn't already commonplace in gaming. Instead, it was the showing of Microsoft's Xbox One that cemented PlayStation as the leader for a generation. What some may not know is the exact same thing happened at E3 only 18 years earlier. This is the story of the PlayStation. In this second part, we'll be taking a look at the first year and a half of the PlayStation's life, covering the launch of the PlayStation in North America and PAL regions. We'll also be taking a look at the titles that defined the early days of the PlayStation, from Wipeout to Resident Evil to Tomb Raider, and of course, everyone's favorite marsupial. The first E3 was a history-defining event. For years, video games were showcased at the Consumer Electronics Show. It's at CES, where Nintendo and Sega duked it out in the early 1990s, and where plenty of other major players came to announce the latest in video games. By 1995, however, video games had grown to encompass more and more of CES every year, and it was time for gaming to get its own convention. From May 11th to May 13th, 1995, more than 50,000 people descended upon the Los Angeles Convention Center for the first Electronic Entertainment Expo. The event featured 15 different publishers, showcasing new titles for the 1995 and 1996 calendar year, but the most notable were the big three console manufacturers at the time: Sega, Nintendo, and Sony. Nintendo's showcase was surprisingly limited at the event. While Sony and Sega already had their new systems out in Japan, Nintendo was still working on their next console, then dubbed the Nintendo Ultra 64. In its place was the underwhelming Virtual Boy, that launched only a few months after the event. Sony was focused on making a big splash with the PlayStation, and brought out many of its top American executives to the event. Sony started their press conference with a look at the various products the company had created over the years, including the Walkman and the CD. The trailer lasted only a few minutes, and ended with a look at the PlayStation. It was Sony's way of telling the gaming world that they were ready to innovate in gaming as much as they had in other business sectors. Most of the event for Sony was presented by Olof Olofsson, President and CEO of Sony Computer Entertainment. Olofsson's presentation would be unrecognizable by modern standards, as the Icelandic businessman detailed Sony's business strategy for creating and marketing the PlayStation system. The presentation lasted less than 30 minutes, with most of the time discussing the monetary value for Sony getting into the video game market. Olofsson also made sure to point out Sony's other entertainment assets, and boldly stated that while Sony wasn't abandoning their roots of consumer electronics, the company as a whole was now focused on providing one thing: entertainment. As the presentation came to a close, Olofsson rattled off more details about the PlayStation, notably its superior hardware when compared to the 16-bit Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. For the finale of Sony's presentation, Olofsson welcomed Steve Race to the stage. Race was a veteran of the games industry, having worked for Atari and Sega before joining Sony as president of the PlayStation Group in 1993. Race had 4 remarks prepared in advance of the presentation, but these would be discarded as he made his way up to the stage. Race walked up to the microphone and uttered the famous words that cemented the PlayStation as a market leader for a generation. $299. In the weeks before E3, Sega had announced that the North American version of the Sega Saturn would retail for $399, with a planned launch for September 1995. Not only had Sony beat them on pricing, but the PlayStation was set to launch in North America just 1 week later. Sony was no longer interested in playing with its video game competitors. They were ready to redefine the industry. The best news for the PlayStation, however, came the day after Sony's press conference. Sega went into E3 1995 with a bit of a chip on their shoulder. At the time, Sega of America was under the direction of Tom Klaczynski. Klaczynski joined Sega in 1990 and helped steer the fledgling Genesis into the most popular video game console in North America. Klaczynski was still beholden to Sega's board of directors in Japan, and in the run-up to E3, they had come to a bizarre decision. During Sega's E3 press conference, Klaczynski announced that the Sega Saturn, set to launch in only 4 months, was available at select retailers that very day. It was an unprecedented move by Sega. The early launch was meant to give Sega a leg up on Sony, much like they had done with Nintendo only a few years earlier. A 4-month head start might have helped Sega if they hadn't been so secretive with their plans. The Sega Saturn launched that day for $399 alongside 6 titles. Unfortunately, stock was short, and retailers left out of Sega's scheme were upset that they never received the latest Sega console. For many, this was the beginning of Sega's long fall from grace as one of gaming's biggest players. The rest of E3 was a hit for Sony. Their booths on the show floor attracted plenty of eager gamers who were ready to check out the latest in gaming. In one final twist of the knife, Sony invited pop superstar Michael Jackson to their booth, where the king of pop was seen checking out the PlayStation. It was another blow to Sega, who beforehand had worked with Michael Jackson on a Moonwalker game for the Genesis and on the music for Sonic the Hedgehog 3. The next 4 months flew by. The Saturn floundered in the summer sun during this time, as stock shortages and a lack of software continued to plague the system, with most third-party publishers sticking to their original release schedule for the Saturn. A 4-month head start would have been great, but only if you could actually keep up. Sony backed the PlayStation with a massive $40 million ad campaign in the lead up to its September launch. Thanks to the growing popularity of video games, TV commercials have become more and more common, and Sony was fully embracing them. A series of commercials with the tagline, "You are not red, E," and "Enos," or "Ready 9th of September," littered commercial breaks in advance of the system's release. These early commercials were primarily targeted at teenagers, as Sony hoped to steal one of Sega's key demographics. For North America, the long wait for the PlayStation finally came to an end on September 9, 1995. The PlayStation launched for $299 and came with a PlayStation console, a single controller, and all of the necessary hookups for the system. Like many other CD-based consoles of the day, the PlayStation could also be used as a CD player, a feature Sony boasted about when showcasing the PlayStation as a multimedia platform, as opposed to just a game console. Unlike other console manufacturers of the day, however, Sony opted not to include a game with the PlayStation, in part to keep costs down. A total of 10 titles were released for the PlayStation on day one. Namco's Ridge Racer was just as popular in North America as it was in Japan. New releases like Ubisoft's 2D platformer Rayman and a port of Midway's Mortal Kombat 3 added variety to the lineup. In North America, PlayStation games were released in tall, plastic cases, almost exactly like the ones that Sega used for the Sega CD and Sega Saturn in North America. This was in contrast to these smaller jewel cases used by both Sony and Sega in Japan. These oversized boxes wouldn't last for long, and in less than a year would be phased out entirely in favor of jewel cases. The PlayStation also launched with a handful of accessories, including standalone controllers, memory cards for saving data, and a system link cable for multiplayer titles. Sony's North American launch was a major success, with the PlayStation outselling the Saturn within 2 days in the region. Less than 3 weeks after launch in North America, the PlayStation was released in European markets on September 29, 1995. The European launch didn't feature as many titles as the North American launch, but the PlayStation's killer app, Ridge Racer, was available alongside Wipeout, a futuristic racing game developed by Sony-owned Psygnosis. For many Europeans, Wipeout would define the launch of the PlayStation, much like Ridge Racer had in other regions. The launch across Europe was a major success, especially in the United Kingdom, where Psygnosis was located. In the UK alone, Sony dedicated a total of £20 million to marketing the PlayStation. The marketing campaign paid off in spades, as the PlayStation outsold the Sega Saturn 3-1 in the country during the holiday 1995 shopping season. The last 3 months of 1995 were dominated by new releases on the PlayStation. Thanks to Sony's diligence, plenty of developers were lining up to release their games on the system. Alongside Ridge Racer, Namco published Air Combat, the first game in the popular Ace Combat series. Namco followed up their racing and aerial combat games with a port of their 1994 fighting game, Tekken, in November. The 3D fighter was an immediate success on the system, with many drawing comparisons to Sega's own Virtua Fighter series. Sony Computer Entertainment was also publishing some early hits on the console. Twisted Metal and Jumping Flash both made their North American debut in November, with other regions receiving the game at different times. Twisted Metal became a smash hit for Sony and the PlayStation, with multiple sequels appearing on the system and its successor, the PlayStation 2. Jumping Flash, a first-person platformer co-developed by Ultra and Exact, was one of the earliest 3D platformers and came out over a year before the industry-changing Super Mario 64. Other real notable games to come out during these months were Warhawk, a military shooter published by Sony, and a port of Micropose's XCOM UFO Defense. The final region to receive the PlayStation did so on November 15, 1995, when it was released in Australia. With the land down under finally getting their hands on Sony's Grey console, the rollout of the PlayStation was complete. In less than a year, the PlayStation made its way onto store shelves in almost every major region in the world. But the year ahead wouldn't be a cakewalk, as Sony's former business partner Nintendo prepared the world for their next system. Going into 1996, gaming was transitioning from 2D to 3D games, and the biggest name in gaming, Nintendo, was about to throw their hat in the ring. The PlayStation, however, was only getting more and more popular. In March of 1996, the first killer app for the PlayStation hit store shelves, Resident Evil. Developed by Capcom and directed by Shinji Mikami, Resident Evil offered a drastically different form of gameplay compared to its contemporaries. Rather than focusing on killing enemies or achieving high scores, Resident Evil focused on survival. Combined with horror elements like zombies, mutants, and a spooky mansion, Resident Evil helped pioneer the survival horror genre of the mid-1990s, alongside titles like Alone in the Dark and later PlayStation releases like Silent Hill. Resident Evil quickly became the best-selling game on the PlayStation. Alongside various re-releases on the system, Resident Evil sold more than 5 million copies worldwide, and established the new horror series as a juggernaut in gaming. E3 1996 followed in May of that year. Sony's focus was on their software lineup, with the company showcasing multiple new titles aimed for release on the PlayStation by the end of the year. The most notable announcement for the PlayStation during the show regarded the ongoing price wars with Sega. On the first day of E3 1996, Sega announced that the Saturn would see a price cut and received a new MSRP of $199. Sega had already cut the price of the Saturn down to $300 in October of 1995, but in their desperate attempt to salvage the system, Sega was taking an even bigger loss on their hardware. Sony responded by lowering the price of the PlayStation to $199 as well, although Sony lost less on each PlayStation than Sega did for each Saturn they manufactured, due to lower manufacturing cost. Like Sega and Sony, Nintendo announced that the Nintendo 64, once suggested to sell for $250, would launch at the same price as its competitors, $199 US. The second half of 1996 was highlighted by multiple notable games. Psygnosis became one of PlayStation's premier developers during this time, with 7 different games hitting the PlayStation in 1996. Among these releases was a 3D version of Psygnosis' popular Lemmings game called Lemmings 3D, and a sequel to Wipeout called Wipeout 2097. Sequels to popular games like Tekken and Twisted Metal quickly made their way onto the PlayStation. Tekken 2 was released in August and was more popular than the original release, selling over 5 million copies on the system. Twisted Metal 2 was directed by David Jaffe, who would later go on to create the God of War series, and became the best-selling game in the series with over 1.5 million copies sold. In November, North America received the first in Atlus's Persona series, Revelations Persona. Not all games released for the PlayStation during this time were good, however. One of the most infamous PlayStation releases of late 1996 was the critically panned Bubsy 3D, published by Accolade. The game is cited by many as one of the worst video games ever released. In November of 1996, the PlayStation received a new game called Tomb Raider, and its popularity would quickly eclipse the other titles on Sony's platform. Developed by Core Design and published by Eidos Interactive, Tomb Raider didn't make a huge impression on the gaming community until demos of the game were showcased at E3 1996. The game's stunning graphics and fun gameplay were enough to get people interested, but it was Tomb Raider's leading lady that caught most players' eyes. At the time, female protagonists in video games were few and far between. Outside of helmeted heroes like Metroid Samus Aran, or the pink bow sporting palette swap called Miss Pac-Man, the biggest female characters in gaming were your typical damsels in distress. With Tomb Raider, players weren't just playing as an androgynous suit of armor or 7/8 of a yellow circle. They were playing as Lara Croft, a fully developed female character, whose own presentation sported a feminine and adventurous look. In the coming years, Lara Croft would become one of gaming's biggest names, and help push the first Tomb Raider title to be the 9th best-selling game on the PlayStation, with over 7 million copies sold worldwide. One game, however, would come to define the PlayStation in 1996. It was one of Sony's own titles, developed by a little-known game studio in Santa Monica, California. Founded as Jam Software in 1984, Naughty Dog spent the past decade primarily developing games for personal computers. After changing their name in 1991, Naughty Dog released their first console game, Rings of Power, in 1992. In 1994, Naughty Dog released Way of the Warrior for the 3DO, and it was published by Universal Interactive Studios. Alongside publishing the game, Universal also agreed to a 3-game contract with the developer and gave them space on their studio lot to expand. Naughty Dog co-founders Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin moved the small developer across the country to Los Angeles. Along the way, the two of them began creating concepts for what they would call Sonic's Ass Game, based on the idea that a 3D camera in a platformer would always be directed towards the characters behind. The concept came about as the two discussed the shifting of genres from 2D sprite-based gameplay to polygonal 3D gameplay. The two continued to redefine the concepts for their game as they traveled across the country. When they were settled into their new offices, they presented the idea to Mark Cerny, then vice president of Universal Interactive. Cerny liked the idea of the title and gave the go-ahead for Naughty Dog to begin development. Dissatisfied with the higher-end consoles on the market, Naughty Dog looked to Sony's upcoming PlayStation console to develop their platformer for. By the end of 1994, Naughty Dog had signed on to create games for the PlayStation, and they purchased a development kit from Sony to begin their work. The development team for the new title grew over 1995. The team looked to Sonic the Hedgehog as inspiration as they used a cartoonish marsupial as the new game's mascot. Naughty Dog even created a demo reel of the game and presented it to Sony, who agreed to help publish the title. The project was given its final name in the lead-up of E3 1996, when the team finally landed on Crash Bandicoot. Internally, fights between Universal and Naughty Dog almost caused the game to be pulled from the show, but it still made its premiere at E3 1996. Crash Bandicoot was featured heavily during both Sony's press conference and on the showroom floor. When walking into Sony's section of the showroom, E3 attendees were greeted with a massive replica of the game's protagonist and demos of the game running on PlayStation hardware. Crash Bandicoot launched just a few months later on September 9, 1996, 1 year after the PlayStation's launch in North America. The title was met with strong critical and commercial success. Players loved the crisp graphics, fun gameplay, and wacky characters the game offered up. Like Jumping Flash before it, Crash Bandicoot helped pioneer the early 3D platformer genre, but more importantly, it gave Sony an icon. Crash Bandicoot would never reach the same heights of popularity as Nintendo's Mario or Sega's Sonic, but he was the closest thing Sony had to a mascot for North American audiences. The title would go on to be the 10th best-selling game on the PlayStation platform, with almost 7 million copies sold. As 1996 came to a close, Sony was doing well. A handful of major hits throughout the year had helped establish Sony and the PlayStation as legitimate players in the game industry. But that momentum would be stalled in the latter half of the year. On September 19, 1996, the sleeping giant of the games industry released one of the most powerful game consoles to date, the Nintendo 64. The holiday 1996 season was an all-out battle between Sony and Nintendo, as the two console manufacturers struggled to lay claim to the North American video game market. Like Sega before them, Sony was able to hold up against Nintendo, with the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 selling roughly the same amount of units during the holiday shopping season. But for Sony, they were just getting started. In the coming years, Sony wouldn't just establish itself as a major player in gaming. They would come to lead the pack. Thanks for watching. This is the second part in a multi-part series covering the story of the PlayStation. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and share it on your favorite social media sites. In the comments below, tell me your thoughts on the PlayStation's games that came out during this time. In the next part, our story continues with some of the biggest games of all time coming to the PlayStation during the year that changed everything, 1997.